Welcome to the Theologic Life podcast. Today we're working through one of the most challenging questions that people have about the Christian faith. And the question is, how can God exist if there's evil in the world? This is a big nut to crack, and we're going to break it down into some smaller chunks. So first off, Lawrence, as a pastor, I'm sure you've been asked this question many times before. What are some things that we need to keep in mind as we start to have a conversation like this?
Yeah. Well, we do get asked this question a lot. And I think it's really important that the place that we start is by acknowledging that there's often a lot of pain uh, coming from the person who asks this question. That's not a bad thing. That's just the reality of it. This is a shorthand for this question. We often call it the problem of evil or the problem of suffering. And there are two perspectives that we need to keep in mind depending on the audience that may be asking this question or the person that this is coming from. There can be two types of people. The first one is the intellectual person. This is someone who asks this question about the problem of evil, the problem of suffering, asking, does God really exist? Because the thought exercise is pretty fun. And to some extent, I can relate to that person. I enjoy mental exercises. I enjoy asking probing questions so I can learn more and continue to grow intellectually. That's definitely one side of the coin. And so we want to today walk through the intellectual side of the argument, the intellectual evidence for why we believe that the problem of evil question, why it can be answered, essentially. The other side is more of the emotional side of someone asking that question. And this is a much bigger category that we have to keep in mind. So the intellectual side, of course, is thinking through, just for the fun of it. The emotional side is really when people come and they ask this question about the problem of evil, can God really exist? And they're wondering, how could God allow all of the things in my life that have happened to me? All of my pain, all of my suffering, the people who have left me, the hurts, the experiences. There are significant evils and significant moments of suffering that have happened. Why would God put me through that? That's a really big question. And of course, that's really what we want to get into today. We want to answer the intellectual, we want to answer the emotional side of it. But before we start to do that, a couple caveats, if you will. But for someone who's experiencing this side of the coin, I would say, I want you to know before we start, God does not hate you. That's a big one. That's one that we feel. God does not hate you. God is not judging you and in your circumstances. Oh, God must be doing this because he's mad at me or because that's not the case. God is not playing with your emotions. I've heard that one before, where I feel this way and God is kind of just teasing me. He's causing these bad things to happen to mess with me. He's not doing that. And then the other one, God has not abandoned you in your situation. Another big one. Because I think those are very common perspectives that people come from in this conversation, wondering, why are these things happening? It must be God doing it to me. It must be his fault. And so I feel like God is against me. And he's not. God is not against you in any of those ways. And yes, he does exist. So we're going to get into all of those things. But I want you to know that in advance. Also, depending on what point in the conversation you jump in here, if you are someone who falls more on the intellectual side of asking the question, there are going to be maybe parts of this discussion that you don't really care about, or maybe it annoys you, or on the other side, you're coming at this because in your life there's been significant emotion around this question, significant hurt, significant pain. You might get frustrated at the intellectual answer or the intellectual response that we give. In any of those situations, no matter who you are, what I would ask is stick with it. Continue working through some of these big concepts. And if you can, try to find a way to put yourself in the other person's shoes. What are they feeling? What are they thinking? Because different people need different things. And so when we're talking through the intellectual side of the argument, we're not being heartless. And when we're talking through the more emotional side of the argument, we're not being unintellectual, right? So find out where you are, evaluate that a little bit, and then work through the problem of evil and problem of suffering with us.
Yeah, so stick with us. And it's important to reiterate that we don't take these questions like this lightly. We do like to have fun here, but we want to be cognizant that some of these questions are deeply personal, and we want to respect that. So we are going to humbly walk forward with this. We're going to be confident as we do that, but we are going to be humbly walking through that. So let's start with the first perspective, I mean, the intellectual side. Maybe start by explaining, what is the problem of evil first, and then walk us through your response to that.
Yeah. The problem of evil can look a variety of different ways depending on who's posing the question. So I put together a very simple 5-point argument that is most often used when talking through the problem of evil. And so walk through this with me. And if you've heard different variations, that's okay. But this is the one that we're going to go through. So the argument starts with premise number 1, that God exists. When you have arguments like this is usually how they begin, where you acknowledge a premise, and then through the argument, you either seek to prove that premise is correct, or you seek to prove that it's not correct. So number 1, God exists. That's where the argument starts. Then you move into point number 2. God exists, and God is a variety of things. He is omniscient. He is omnipotent. He is omnibenevolent. What in the world do those words mean? Well, God is first off omniscient. This is the idea that we certainly see in Scripture, that God knows everything. He knows everything, and omnipotent, he is all powerful. So God can do anything that he wants to do. He knows everything, and he's powerful enough to do anything that he wants to do. Then omnibenevolent, this is the idea of all loving. So you have all knowing, all powerful, and all loving. The idea there with all loving is not only does God know everything that is going to happen, he's powerful enough to intervene in it, but also God is all loving, and so he would intervene in the best possible way, or at least in the way that would be for my good in my situation, or the world's good in its situation. So point number 1, God exists. Point number 2, he is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving. Well, then you get into point number 3. If God is indeed all those things, he's omniscient, he's omnipotent, and he is omnibenevolent. If that is all true, then he won't allow evil and suffering to exist. Understand the logic in that. If God really is all-knowing, he really does know that there are good things happening in the world and there are bad things happening in the world. If he really knows that, and if he's really powerful enough to stop it, which he would stop it if, point number 3, that he really was all-loving, if all of that was true, God would not allow evil. God would not allow suffering. God would not allow all of these things that have happened to me in my life. Then you get to point number 4. Well, evil does exist. Suffering does exist. And so, point number 5, therefore, God must not exist.
I feel like I can hear a lot of people nodding along, like, yeah, that sounds like
that all tracks, right? Yeah, absolutely. So there may be actually people who have not heard this argument before, and you hear those 5 points, and like you said, it probably makes sense. And if you're a Christian, maybe it makes you squirm a little bit because you've not really walked through something like this before. Because yes, it is very convincing. If God exists, if God is all powerful, all knowing, all loving, and yet evil exists in the world, God should stop it. And so if it's not stopped, if it does exist, he must not be there. When I teach this in a classroom, I often ask people, I write out all 5 points on the board, and I ask people to look at lines 1 through 5. And essentially by evaluating the argument together, I say, point out at what point on this argument that you think that they have gone wrong. And different people will have different takes on where they think the argument breaks down. And it's great for sake of time, I'm going to present what I believe where I believe the biggest breakdown is. But anyway, the first two lines I think are solid. Of course, God exists. I agree. This is a good starting premise. I'm not going to really argue with anything there. The second point, God is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent. I think there's a lot of defining of terms that needs to take place as we're walking through that. But again, if you allow me to define what those mean, yes, I am on board with the fact that he knows everything. He's all powerful. He's all loving. That's great. These are, of course, very evidenced in Scripture. Then you hit the third line. And this is where I think the most obvious breakdown begins. But if God is omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, he won't allow evil and suffering to exist. That's the point. And there's a glaring problem in this, and it might not be right away what you would expect. But first thing I want to point out is that we are granting God in this premise that God knows everything. And the reason that we're doing that is because we want, certainly, God to know the things that I've experienced. We want him to know the evils that I've lived through. We want him to know the hurt in my life. We want him to know the pain in my life. And so we bring that up and we say, God knows everything because we need him to know. We want him to know specifically the evil and the hurt in our life. But what we've done, and you can see this the more you examine this argument, what we've done is we've really put omniscience in a box. This idea that God knows everything. The claim is that omniscience is knowing bad things that would happen, right? That's part of it. The reality is that omniscience is God knows everything, right? It's not just the bad things that God knows. It's God knows everything. And so if you're going to grant God that he is in fact omniscient, you grant him that he does in fact know everything. There are other things that need to be considered that God may know and you don't know. For instance, you would have to grant that God would know any and all alternatives to your current experience and situation. You would have to grant that if there were such thing as other possibilities, other hypotheticals out there of what your life could be, what could be happening around you, that God would know of all of those different possibilities, what ones were better or what ones were best, what ones were worse, because that would be a part of the equation for an all-knowing God. It would be an equation that you couldn't even begin to conceive, let alone solve. Tracking with that right now?
Yeah, so you have to take all of the omni with it. You can't just take
all
half
of the omni with it. That's a great way to put it. Yes. Take all of the omni with it. The big problem is that what we've done is we've really placed ourselves in God's shoes, where whether we recognize it or not, God in his omniscience and in what he knows is kind of placed in a box beneath us where, yes, of course, God is omniscient and he knows everything that I know. We've kind of placed him in that spot of he knows everything, so he knows what I know. Does that make sense? Yeah. Kind of where that breaks down. And I'm not arguing, because I know some people have done this. I'm not arguing that from like a multiple world theory perspective where God chose the best possible world or the best possible outcome. That is an argument that's out there. That's not really what I'm trying to say. Simply pointing out that what we need to acknowledge, if God truly is all of the omnis, he is all knowing, he is all powerful, he is all loving, that he would, in fact, know and do the best thing out there. And we might not always know what the best thing is. And we have to grant God that, at the very least. We have to grant him that if he is all of those things, that there may be a possibility where the evil and the suffering that we're experiencing actually is part of something greater and something bigger than what we immediately see.
Mm-hmm.
Tracking?
Yeah, I think if you even examine yourself if you're honest about it, you can examine yourself and think back of a time when maybe you didn't feel that way initially, and then years pass and you go back and reflect on it. It's like, oh wow, yeah, there's a lot more of that story that just wasn't written yet, and I couldn't see it. And at the time, yeah, it hurt, but you end up seeing the full picture.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the second then point to all that is you have the omniscience issue, which we can deal with. The second issue, I think, is even more glaring that we're going to get into here. But we have the crux of the third point, that God is allowing evil and suffering to exist. He's all these things, all these different attributes, of course, but ultimately he's allowing evil and he's allowing suffering in the world. Big idea that we need to understand in this. Bold idea. Might not make sense at first, but just walk through this with me. My bold idea for the day is that evil cannot exist unless God exists. So the premise that we come from often when we say that evil exists here is we have this idea that only one of these things can exist at the same time. If God exists, evil must not. And if evil exists, then God must not. I'm kind of flipping that on its head a little bit, saying that evil cannot exist unless he does. Now, before you call me a heretic, before you turn this off and run away, there are real reasons why we can walk through this, again, intellectually speaking. What we need to understand is that evil is, of course, a moral term. So when we have a moral term that we're dealing with, we're acknowledging that, of course, there is good and there is evil in our universe right now. And we dipped into this a little bit a few episodes ago when we started walking through the moral argument. But you have to ask yourself, what is my basis for describing something as good? And what is my basis for describing something as evil? It's the ultimate define your terms moment, because you have to acknowledge there is a premise that I'm coming from when I make a moral declaration on something. And that morality must have an origin to it as well. The main argument that we see in that, certainly this comes from our culture quite often, is, well, morality is something that is kind of just innate to me. Right? I define what is moral. I define what is good. I define what is evil. And in doing that, you have several flaws. Okay, if evil is simply a subjective thing, it's, I have my good, I have my evil, my definitions of those things. You over there have your definitions of something that is good, something that is evil. There may come a point where our definitions of good and evil disagree with one another, right? Where I call something good and you call it evil, and we're kind of at an impasse. And the question is, which one is right? Which one is moral? Which one is good? Which one is evil? Who is right on that issue? And you certainly can't say that both of us are right, because you have two competing thoughts out there. And you have a real problem then with the standard of morality. The standard of morality must not come from the individual. The standard of morality must come from something outside of the individual that then the individual person subscribes to, right? There must be a standard, a universal standard that's out there that says these are the laws of what good and evil are, and we all then come at it and acknowledge, yes, I am agreeing and coming under that umbrella. Well, again, other ways that people try to get around this, well, try to state that, well, evil and good are not just defined by me, but actually good and evil are defined by, or morality is defined by, the society. We all come together as societies and we discuss the things that we believe are good, the things that we believe are evil. And then that is what sets the standard, so that when we come together in a room and we're discussing morality, we are essentially discussing the things that have been passed down through our society. What we have come to agree upon are things that are good and things that are evil. Again, you have a problem. What if you have another society out there that has a different set of moral laws that their culture has passed down. And now you have an entire culture, entire society that is disagreeing with your entire culture and your society. And you have disagreements on what you think is good and what you think is evil. Again, you just have a blown up version of what has happened at the individual level. And you have, of course, some very common arguments around this with Hitler, right? How can you tell Hitler that what he did was wrong back in the day if it's simply at the individual level? If I say, Hitler, what you did was wrong, and Hitler says, no, what I'm doing is good. Well, if morality comes from just within you, you have a problem, right? Because then Hitler, based on his own subjective moral standard, is right in doing all the things that he did. Well, again, you draw it back to then the society level. If our society says what Hitler did was bad, but then his society, his culture says, no, what you're doing is good, you still have the same issue. And what can begin to happen if you're not defining your terms correctly, if you're not understanding morality correctly, is you begin to then justify different types of morality out there because you're trying to get rid of the standard, which the ultimate standard is God himself, right? God, as the all good being out there, has set a standard of morality for us. And then everyone here that has, that is declares something as good or evil is declaring something that either is in line with God and with his character, which is all good, or it falls short of the standard of God, and so it's evil. Well, we're trying to get rid of God as the standard, so we're trying to say it comes from the individual or it comes from society. What you end up doing is you end up green lighting different types of evil that exists because you're trying to get rid of the standard that's out there. And all of that is an attempt to get rid of the evil and suffering that we're frustrated by. Does that make sense? How all of this kind of just gets you into a bit of a logical, circular reasoning in a sense that you end up falling apart.
You kind of try to fix one and then it creates two more problems and then back and forth we go.
Exactly. So back to the start of all of this. What I said as the main point is that evil cannot exist unless God exists. And the reason is, as I said, God is the ultimate standard of morality. He is an all good being that exists. And because he is all good and he is declared based on his character, who he is declared, these are the things that are good, the things that are in line with me. Anything else that is outside of me, outside of my will, is evil. That is the only way, based on that standard, that universal standard, that's the only way that we can point things out as evil. So the argument kind of breaks down right there by bringing up good and evil and not having a good solution for evil apart from the existence of God.
So we don't need to even go to step 4 and 5 because it just, the problem
just
stops.
falls apart right there. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yep.
So that's on the intellectual side. Just to recap, we do need God to exist, for morality to exist, but that doesn't really help us with the emotions in it all. So that part of this question just still is not satisfied, especially if my life is falling apart, especially if I've experienced some really true evils. I mean, what would you say to someone who's grappling with this question and they feel like God has let them down and let them get hurt?
Yeah. We need to understand certainly the intellect of God, but we need to understand the emotion of God as well. There are probably a lot of people listening to this explanation and to this point, what you're thinking is that, sure, maybe God exists. Maybe I need a standard out there for morality. Maybe God has to exist for that to be true. But what you're left with is, yeah, maybe God exists, but if he does, if he really is an all-knowing God, he really is an all-powerful God, he really is supposedly an all-loving God, all this stuff ends up being true. What it feels like is, sure, God may exist, but if he exists, he's kind of a jerk. Because look at my life. Look at what I'm left with. He's let all these things happen to me, all these evil things, these bad things. he must be a jerk. To speak very clearly at this point, I want you to know that God does exist and God is not a jerk. And to walk through the emotion of it, I want us to walk through God's perspective on the evil and suffering that's in our world. Because what can happen is we feel all that we feel with the problem of evil. We're sitting in our circumstances and they're hard, and all of that is true. But we can become very isolated in that. And the only perspective that can make sense is the one that we're sitting in right now. But of course, God is much bigger. What he sees is much bigger. What he knows is much bigger. And so walking through a little bit the story of evil and the problem of evil, I think is important. So from the moment that God created the world, we know this to be true, that he declared all things good when he made it. So if you go to Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, it says this: God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning the sixth day. So evil was not a part of God's original design. God did not make the world to be evil. God made the world good. In fact, he made it very good. Not only does he make it good, but then he also enforces that goodness, that very goodness ought to continue. You see in Genesis chapter 2, verse 16 and 17, it says, "And the Lord God commanded the man," so he's made Adam here in the garden. He commands him. He says, "You are free to eat of any tree in the garden, but you must not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For when you eat from it, you will certainly die." What God expects of his creation when he creates Adam is this goodness that I have made the world to be. Do not mess it up, right? Follow me, obey me. I'm commanding you to do this, to be my servant here on earth. Do that. And here's this parameter that you need to live by. Do not disobey me. This tree here, the knowledge of good and evil, I'm planting it here in the garden. Do not eat from that tree, because of course that would be bad. And you also see then the judgment that takes place for that evil, which is if you eat from it, you will certainly die. Well, what happens? Genesis 3, verses 6 and 7 says, "When the woman saw the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves." God set the parameter in his very good world, said, "Follow me, do not sin. If you sin, you will certainly die." Adam and Eve then rebel against this perfect design that God created. And as a result, the good world that God created began to unravel. As sin enters the world, you see the consequences for sin as well. And evil is the result of it all. So that evil is a result ultimately of us, of humanity sinning. Evil is not the result of God and what he created and what he wanted for the world that we live in. So God says, I will not tolerate it. And that's part of the judgment that he announces, is that I will not tolerate the sin. He promised that death would come. He promised that there would be judgment for it. And in the grand scheme of eternity, he's vowed that all evil will be destroyed. That's a really important piece, because sometimes we look at God and we think that God right now in the world that we live in is tolerant of evil. He's tolerant of sin. He's letting all of these things happen. He's not intervening when he could, and so that makes him a bad God. We think that God is tolerant of evil, but really God is the most intolerant being of evil that could exist, because he is an all good God, an all holy God, and has set this standard out there. No matter how old you think the world is, everything that we live in and have experienced is just a tiny blip on all of eternity. And so from eternity past to eternity future, God has existed in all of that, right? Even beyond time, outside of time, God exists. And so when we say God is intolerant of evil, we're saying that whether you think the world, the universe that exists right now is billions or millions or thousands or no one thinks it's hundreds of years old, but right, just being hyperbolic, no matter how old you think the world is or how long you think sin has been in effect, in the grand scheme, the grand perspective of all eternity past and all eternity future, this is just a tiny little blip on all of that. And in all of these, in this tiny portion, God is allowing evil and suffering, of course, to remain.
So to me, that begs the question of why. Like, why does God allow that evil and suffering today?
Yeah. Well, it's not because God's a horrible person or a horrible jerk, which is certainly what it can feel like. But again, in this microcosm of time, God has really extended his grace and mercy to us. So that's not all. Not all of humanity will be condemned to hell. The purpose of this time that we have, this blip in time, is that God has said from that moment with Adam and Eve, guys, you sinned, and right now, right here, right now, yes, the consequence for evil is death. I'm going to make a way out of that. I'm going to make a way for you to be saved. I'm going to send a savior, Jesus Christ, to this earth. And instead of wiping out humanity right now, instead of destroying it all, sending you all to hell, being rid of it all, we actually see a tremendous amount of grace and mercy given to us in not wiping it all out and starting over. But he continues. That's not to say that he's not going to be rid of it once and for all eventually. But at least in this microcosm of time, it's, hey, I'm here, I'm sending a savior, and through this life, I am seeking the salvation of the lost. All of this then leads eventually to Revelation chapter 21, verse 1 through 4, where we see the end eventually happen. It says, "Then I saw a new heaven and new earth, for the first heaven and first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down from heaven, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. As I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be their God.' Verse 4, he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." There is a point coming where there will be no more evil and there will be no more suffering, where the God who is intolerant of all of it will eventually do away with it. And those who have believed in him, who have surrendered their life to him in the midst of the evil world that we live in, those people will get to be with him forever. In this line that God's dwelling place will be with them, he will be their God, they will be his people. That is what we get to experience forever. Him wiping away our tears and these things being no more. Where does that leave us, right? Well, it doesn't fix it, of course. It doesn't fix the problem of our day-to-day experience. It doesn't fix the problem of our pain, our suffering. It doesn't fix any of those things. And I suppose we're not trying to fix it right now. But I think it does leave us in our impression of God, which is the most important part for those of us who are struggling emotionally with God's existence in these times. It leaves us with a God who's not left us, a God who's not messed with us, a God who's not hurt us, a God who has not caused the pain around us. But instead, it's a God who has condemned all of those things. And he's also offered to walk through it with us. All of it leading, of course, until the point where he gets rid of it forever. That's the God who exists, not one who's a jerk and not one who's messing with you, but a God who loves you and wants to make a way out.
That's really helpful. I think one thing that comes to mind with all that is I think to believe that you have to have a really big view of God. Like
Yeah.
God has to be a really big thing. So I guess what do you say to someone that maybe doesn't hold that view that God is big enough to hold that all together, or however you want to phrase that, but how do you walk through that?
Yeah. Well, certainly what I would advocate for, as you've been saying, is a very big view of God. That God is bigger than our circumstances, that he is bigger than all of this. And what people have to come to, what they have to realize is you don't want a small God in your life. You don't want a God who's out of control. You don't want a God who doesn't know what's happening next. All of these omnis that we walked through at the beginning, being all knowing, all powerful, all loving. You don't want God to be any less of those things. You don't want God to not know you. You don't want God to not be powerful enough to stop it. You don't want God to be any less loving and not care for you. Anything that would make God less than who he is, you really don't want that.
Yeah.
Even if in the moment it feels difficult and it feels like maybe he's not as great or not as big as you initially thought. He is, right? According to the testament of Scripture, we know that he is. And we know that that is the God that we want, a big God who can intervene, who will intervene, and one day will make it all right.
Man, what a great note to end on. Yes. If you found that content today helpful and encouraging, please take a moment to just like and subscribe. It really does help us reach more people. But on another note, if today's topic sparks some questions of your own, we want to hear them. So send us an email at theologiclife@gmail.com or leave a comment. And remember, your theology and logic impact how you live your life. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.